If you could climb into a time machine and spin the dial to any century in the last 2,000 years, you might think you're picking a destination for a nice vacation. But history has a different plan. Almost every 100-year block of our existence has been defined by one massive, world-shaping collision of empires. It is a recurring rhythm where the maps are redrawn and entire generations are swept up in the tides of change. Today, we are going on a journey through time to identify the single most impactful conflict of every century. We aren't just looking at who won or lost, but how these moments transformed the human experience, shifted the balance of power, and eventually paved the way for the world you see outside your window right now. These are the eras where the stakes were at their absolute highest, and where the decisions of a few leaders changed the lives of millions forever. Let's start our journey in the 2nd century, specifically around the year 161. The Roman Empire was at its peak, a golden age of stability and wealth. But under the surface, the borders were beginning to vibrate with tension. The Marcomannic Wars were not just a series of skirmishes. They were a systemic challenge to the very idea of Roman dominance. For nearly 2 decades, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, had to trade his books for a sword. He spent years in the cold, damp forests of Central Europe, trying to hold back a massive migration of Germanic tribes. This conflict was the first major cracks in the foundation. It forced Rome to militarize its economy and set a precedent for the centuries of struggle that would eventually follow. If Rome had failed here, the entire history of Western civilization would have been rewritten 1,000 years early. It was a brutal reminder that even the most powerful structures are vulnerable if the pressure from the outside becomes great enough. As we move into the 3rd century, we find a world that looks like a fractured mirror. This was the era of the crisis of the 3rd century, but at its heart was a relentless series of civil struggles and external pressures. The most significant of these was the rise of the Sassanid Empire in the east. This wasn't the old Parthian rival. This was a revitalized, highly organized power that actually managed to capture a Roman emperor in the field. The scale of this rivalry defined the 3rd century. It forced the Roman world to split into 3 pieces just to survive. While the empire eventually pulled back together, the cost was a permanent shift in how people lived. Cities began building massive walls for the first time in centuries, and the open, connected world of the early empire began to close in on itself. This century taught humanity that security comes at a very high price, often at the expense of freedom and prosperity. The 4th century brings us to a moment of ideological and physical transformation. While there were many battles, the most devastating in terms of long-term impact was the Gothic War that culminated in the late 370s. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a crisis of refugees and mismanagement. A massive group of people, displaced by the Huns further east, sought safety within the Roman borders. When the authorities failed to provide for them, a massive uprising occurred. The resulting conflict shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. For the first time in centuries, an imperial army was defeated on its own soil, and an emperor was lost in the tumult. This broke the Roman military machine and forced a new era of uneasy integration that would define the next 100 years. By the 5th century, the map was beginning to dissolve. This is the century of the Huns. Attila the Hun became a name that whispered terror into the hearts of everyone from the Rhine to the Danube. The conflict between the Huns and the combined forces of the Roman and Germanic worlds reached its peak in the mid-450s. This wasn't just a struggle for land. It was a struggle for the very survival of the Mediterranean order. It was a chaotic, sprawling mess of alliances and betrayals. When the dust finally settled, the Western Roman Empire was a hollow shell, and the Germanic tribes had carved out the beginnings of what would become the nations of Europe: France, Spain, and England. The 5th century was a forge, and the Huns were the hammer. Moving into the 6th century, we encounter a conflict that most people have never heard of. Yet it changed the world more than almost any other. This was the Byzantine-Sassanid War of 502 to 628. It was a marathon of destruction. For over 100 years, the 2 greatest superpowers of the age threw everything they had at each other. They fought until both were completely exhausted, their treasuries empty, and their populations depleted. Just as they finished their final, most intense round of fighting, a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Because the 2 giants were so weakened, they couldn't stand against this new movement. The 6th and early 7th centuries show us how the exhaustion of empires creates a vacuum that the next phase of history will inevitably fill. By the 7th century, the focus shifts entirely. This was the era of the early Islamic expansions. In just a few decades, a new power moved across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. This wasn't just a series of battles, it was a total reconfiguration of the globe. The ancient world was gone. The Mediterranean, which had been a Roman lake for centuries, was now a border between two vastly different civilizations. The sheer speed of this change is still one of the most studied phenomena in history. It redefined trade, language, and culture from the Atlantic to the borders of India. The 8th century was defined by the struggle to determine where those new borders would sit. The most famous moment came in the 730s in the heart of modern-day France. A massive force moved north from Spain, and a Frankish leader named Charles Martel stood in their way. This was a clash of two very different ways of organizing a society. The result of this conflict ensured that Western Europe would develop along its own unique path, separate from the Mediterranean world. It also gave rise to the Carolingian dynasty, which would eventually lead to the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. In the 9th century, the threat came from the sea. This was the age of the Viking expansions. This wasn't one single war, but a century-long series of raids and invasions that hit England, France, and even Russia. These conflicts were devastating because they were so unpredictable. A town could be peaceful one day and gone the next. It forced the people of Europe to develop the system of feudalism, local lords protecting local populations in exchange for labor. The instability of the 9th century essentially created the social structure that would dominate the Middle Ages. The 10th century saw the rise of a new power in the East, the Byzantine Empire's resurgence under the Macedonian dynasty, particularly their long struggle against the Bulgarian Empire. This was a relentless, decades-long conflict that eventually saw the total absorption of the Bulgarian state. It restored the Byzantines as the primary power in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, ensuring that Eastern Orthodox culture would have a secure base for centuries to come. It was a period of high-stakes diplomacy and massive military maneuvers that reshaped the map of Eastern Europe. As we hit the 11th century, we reached the beginning of the Crusades. In the late 1090s, a massive movement started in Europe that aimed at the Middle East. This conflict was different because it was driven by a combination of social pressure, religious fervor, and political ambition. It opened up a corridor of contact between East and West that hadn't existed for centuries. While the human cost was immense, it also brought a flood of new ideas, spices, and technologies into Europe, helping to end the period of isolation that followed the fall of Rome. The 12th century was a time of internal consolidation and massive rivalries in the East. The conflict between the Jin dynasty and the Song dynasty in China was perhaps the largest and most devastating of the era. It involved millions of people and led to the creation of some of the most advanced military technology of the age, including early gunpowder weapons. This struggle eventually weakened the region just in time for the arrival of the most famous conquerors in history. The 13th century belongs to the Mongols. This was the most devastating century in terms of the sheer scale of the change. From the 1200s through the 1290s, the Mongols created the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. They moved from the Pacific to the gates of Vienna. Entire cities were erased from the map, but in their place, a new system of global trade emerged. The Pax Mongolica allowed ideas and goods to travel across Eurasia more safely than ever before. This wasn't just a century of war, it was the birth of global connectivity, even if that birth was incredibly violent. In the 14th century, the world was hit by a double blow. Not only was there the massive pandemic we talked about earlier, but there was also the beginning of the 100 Years' War between England and France. This conflict redefined how nations project power. It saw the rise of the professional archer and the decline of the knight. It forced both nations to develop centralized systems of taxation and governance to fund the endless fighting. This century was a transition from the medieval world to the early modern world, fueled by the pressure of constant struggle. The 15th century was defined by the final fall of Constantinople in 1453. This wasn't just the end of one city. It was the final chapter of the Roman story. The rise of the Ottoman Empire changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean and forced the European powers to look for new trade routes to the east. This search directly led to the voyages across the Atlantic. The conflict of the 1400s essentially pushed humanity into the Age of Discovery. As we move into the 16th century, the scale of conflict becomes global. The rivalries between the Spanish, the French, and the Ottomans played out across oceans and continents. Perhaps the most impactful was the series of conflicts known as the Italian Wars, which turned into a wider struggle for control of Europe. This century also saw the beginning of the religious wars following the Reformation. These weren't just about territory. They were about the very nature of truth and how society should be organized. It was a time of intense personal and political friction. The 17th century was home to the 30 Years' War. This was perhaps the most devastating conflict in European history before the 20th century. It started as a religious dispute but turned into a massive struggle for the survival of different political systems. It was a total conflict that involved almost every person in Central Europe. The result was the Peace of Westphalia, which created the modern idea of the nation-state, the idea that every country is sovereign over its own territory. We still live in the political world that the 1600s created. The 18th century saw the first truly global wars. The 7 Years' War, often called the real First World War, was fought in Europe, India, North America, and the Caribbean. It was a struggle for who would dominate the globe. When the dust settled, Britain emerged as the primary global power, but the cost of the war led to the taxes that sparked the American and French revolutions. The 1700s showed us that the more connected the world becomes, the more a conflict in one place will echo everywhere else. The 19th century was dominated by the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte didn't just fight for land, he fought to spread a new code of laws and a new way of organizing society. His movement across Europe broke the old aristocratic systems and paved the way for the rise of nationalism. After his fall, the 19th century also saw massive conflicts in other parts of the world, like the Taiping Rebellion in China, which was one of the most destructive civil struggles in human history, involving tens of millions of people and reshaping the future of the most populous nation on Earth. Then we come to the 20th century. The scale of the two great world conflicts in this era is almost impossible to grasp. These were industrial-scale struggles that used every ounce of human ingenuity and resource. They redefined everything from technology to human rights. The 1900s showed us that we finally had the power to end our own story if we weren't careful. But they also led to the creation of international bodies like the United Nations, meant to ensure that such a scale of destruction would never happen again. As we look at these centuries, it's easy to focus only on the loss, but history isn't just a list of tragedies. It's a story of how we respond to them. Every one of these conflicts forced humanity to invent something new, a new way of governing, a new way of communicating, or a new way of protecting the vulnerable. We are the descendants of the people who lived through these eras. Our modern world is built on the foundations they laid, often in the most difficult of circumstances. Think about the 8th century again. If a few thousand people hadn't stood their ground in a field in France, the entire cultural makeup of the world you live in today would be different. Think about the 17th century. If the nation-state hadn't been invented to stop the constant fighting, we might still be living in a world of endless overlapping feudal loyalties. These conflicts were the rough tools that shaped the modern world. It's also fascinating to see how the nature of war has changed. It went from local tribes in the 2nd century to global empires in the 18th, to industrial nations in the 20th. We have moved from fighting with handheld tools to fighting with invisible energy and information. But the human element remains the same. It is always about the struggle for resources, the clash of different visions for the future, and the search for security in an uncertain world. Why do we study this? To understand the patterns. If you look at the 14th century, you see that a massive health crisis followed by a long period of fighting led to a total change in the labor market. If you look at the 17th century, you see that a change in climate led to a surge in political tension. By recognizing these patterns, we can hopefully navigate our own century with a bit more wisdom. The story of the most devastating wars in every century is a story of human resilience. It shows that even when we are at our most destructive, we are also at our most innovative. We find ways to rebuild. We find ways to create art and music in the middle of chaos. We find ways to move forward. Imagine being a merchant in the 13th century. Your world has just been turned upside down by a force from the east. But as the fighting stops, you realize you can now travel from Baghdad to Beijing with a single pass. You see the world opening up for the first time. Or imagine being a philosopher in the 17th century, watching your country be torn apart by religious ideology, and deciding to write about why tolerance and reason are the only way forward. These are the sparks of light that come out of the darkness of every century. We have mentioned the Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century, and it's worth dwelling on for a moment. It shows that internal friction can be just as impactful as an invasion by a foreign power. It was a struggle over the very soul of China, and its effects were felt for 100 years afterward. It reminds us that the most significant changes often come from within. The 8th century struggles in the Byzantine world, known as the Arab-Byzantine Wars, were another example of a long-term endurance test. For 700 years, that border moved back and forth. It was a forever war that shaped the religious and ethnic landscape of the entire Mediterranean. It shows us that some conflicts don't have a clean beginning and an end. They are just a feature of the landscape for generations. And what about the Americas? Before the arrival of outsiders, the 15th century saw the expansion of the Aztec and Inca empires. These were massive, sophisticated societies that engaged in their own significant struggles for dominance. Their history is just as vital as the European or Asian stories, showing that the drive for expansion and the friction it causes is a universal human experience, regardless of the ocean you are on. As we look at the 21st century, the story is still being written. We face challenges that are global in scale, just like in the 18th century, but with the speed of the 20th. But we have something that the people of the 2nd or the 13th century didn't have: the knowledge of everything that came before. We can look at the total wars of the 1600s and decide that we prefer diplomacy. We can look at the biological disasters of the 500s and decide that we prefer science. History is a conversation between the past and the present. When we talk about the most devastating century, we aren't just ranking suffering. We are looking at the turning points. We are identifying the moments when one door closed and another opened. Without the chaos of the 5th century, the nations of Europe wouldn't exist. Without the struggles of the 18th century, the modern democratic ideals wouldn't have a foundation. Each of these centuries was someone's modern day. To a Roman in the 160s, the Marcomannic Wars were the most important thing happening in the entire universe. To a peasant in the 1640s, the 30 Years' War was an endless, inexplicable storm. We have the privilege of seeing the whole map at once. We can see how the pain of one era led to the progress of the next. This doesn't mean that conflict is a good thing, but it does mean it is a powerful thing. It is the most intense expression of human will, for better or worse. It forces us to ask, what is worth keeping? What needs to change? And how do we find a way to live together when our interests collide? The 16th century, with its religious shifts, proved that you cannot force unity through strength alone. The 19th century, with its rising nationalism, proved that people want to feel like they belong to something bigger than a single ruler. These are lessons that were bought at a very high price. When we look at the 20th century again, we see the absolute peak of this process. The technology reached a point where the results were no longer just a shift in the map, but a threat to the world itself. This realization is perhaps the most important development in the history of human conflict. We finally found a ceiling. We finally saw that there is a limit to how much destruction a planet can handle. As we conclude this trip through the ages, remember that the map you see today is a palimpsest. It is a document that has been written over, erased, and rewritten thousands of times. Underneath every border is a story of a struggle. Underneath every common language is a history of a collision between cultures. The story of the most devastating wars in every century is ultimately a story of movement. Movement of people, movement of ideas, and movement of power. It is a reminder that the world is never finished. It is always being reshaped by the currents of history. And while the costs are often unimaginable, the resilience of those who survived and rebuilt is what gives us the world we have today. We have seen the transition from the ancient world to the medieval, from the medieval to the modern, and from the modern to the global. Each transition was paved with a century-long challenge. We have survived them all. From the forests of Germania in the 160s to the industrial fields of France in 1914, the human spirit has been tested, stretched, and reformed. So, when you look at the challenges of our own time, don't feel like we are the first to walk through a storm. We are the latest in a long, unbroken line of people who have navigated the most difficult centuries imaginable. We are the heirs to the wisdom, the mistakes, and the endurance of it all. History is the manual for our survival, and as long as we keep learning from it, the future remains a place of possibility rather than just another chapter of conflict. The story doesn't end here. It continues with us. every choice we make to choose collaboration over friction is a tribute to those who didn't have that option. Every time we use our technology to heal instead of harm, we are answering the tragedies of the past with a new kind of future. We are the survivors of 2,000 years of the most intense history possible, and that makes us capable of anything. The world has been broken many times, but it has always been put back together. The 21st century is our time to decide what the next map will look like, and with the knowledge of every century behind us, we have a better chance than any generation before us to get it right. From the 2nd century to the 20th, we have seen the worst, and we have lived to tell the story. Now it's time to start writing a new one.